Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Sherwood Secondary School Public Information Session number 2. My name is Colin Pinckney, and I'm the Superintendent of Student Achievement for Family of Schools 3 here in Hamilton. And my portfolio does include Sherwood Secondary School. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. The Hamilton Wentworth District School Board acknowledges our presence on ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land, as determined by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The intent of this agreement is for all nations sharing this territory to do so responsibly, respectfully, and sustainably in perpetuity. We respect the long-standing relationships with the local Indigenous communities, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'd now like to review the agenda with you all. Begin with introductions and greetings. Carry on to a review of the process. We'll review the history and the options available. And we will look at the themes raised in the questions. We had over 689 questions and comments shared. So as we had discussed previously, we would take a look at all the questions and all the comments, and we would group them according to themes. And by answering and addressing those comments and questions in the themes, we'll be able to address each and every one of the questions and comments that were raised. We will then move on to a summary before proceeding to next steps. I'd like to welcome and introduce the administration from Sherwood Secondary School, Principal Wendell Gillis, and Vice Principals Diana Alexandri and Stephanie McNeil. Once again, I'm Colin Pinckney, Superintendent of Student Achievement. And tonight you will also be hearing from our Associate Director of Learning Services, Sue Dunlop, and our Senior Manager of Facilities Management, David Anderson. I want to highlight and stress to you all that no decision surrounding the future of Sherwood Secondary School has been made. We set out a process for community feedback and we're sticking to it. So step number 1 was back on the February 10th, and many of you were present. We had well over 200 attendees in a virtual session for information around the future of Sherwood Secondary School. We then had an opportunity to submit questions about the process and options for Sherwood. And as I mentioned previously, over 689 comments and questions were submitted. Thank you for that participation. Tonight, we're virtual information session number 2 on the future of Sherwood Secondary School. So at this information session, we're going to respond to the questions and concerns raised by students, families, staff, and interested community members. And lastly, you'll hear more information about this step toward the end of the presentation and even have access to start sharing your voice once again. But more will come there around the survey and your preferred options. I would now like to turn it over to Sue Dunlop, who will take you through the process related to Sherwood and more. Thank you.
Thanks, Superintendent Pinckney. And just doing a voice check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Sue.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start us off just by going back over some of the process related to both Sherwood, the Sherwood site, and to Barton, because we had a number of questions related to this. So we're sharing this information with you, and just want to let you know also that all of this meeting is being recorded and transcribed, and so it will be posted on the board website as well as the slides. And in addition, other information related to questions will also be posted, and I'll share that link with you a little bit further on in the slides. So there are some questions around a pupil accommodation review and whether consultation was necessary in this case. And the Ministry of Education does have detailed guidelines around pupil accommodation reviews, and they identify some exemptions to those requirements. And an exemption applies in this case because both the Barton site and the Sherwood site are in exactly the same catchment area. So what that means basically is, so for Sherwood, there is a large catchment area for students who live within the area, within that boundary, who would attend Sherwood. And Barton, the Barton site is right in the same area. So that's why we have that exemption that applies. And so as a result, no public engagement is required. But HWDSB and the Board of Trustees felt that community input was needed because this is a very important decision. And we've certainly seen that with the high level of interest and engagement so far in the process, which, as Colin said earlier, we really appreciate. And so the feedback that we're going to be getting through the survey on those preferred options will help the Board of Trustees make that final decision. They're very interested to see what feedback comes forward. Next slide, please. So what you'll be able to do is, after you've heard this information, if you were at the first session, you heard the original information. If you weren't, you can go back and listen to the presentation or read through the slides. And then once you've heard today, you can complete the survey. And as Colin said, there will be a link to the survey, so you can simply do that right from your screen if you're ready to do so at the end of today. Just want to make it clear that the survey is not a vote. So it's feedback and more information that will come to the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees will make the final decision on where Sherwood Secondary School students will be housed, either at the Sherwood site or at the Barton site. And as I said before, the trustees are quite interested in that. Other questions that we had were related to why the meetings were held virtually. And so one of the biggest reasons they're being held virtually is because at the time of planning, there were COVID restrictions that would make in-person gatherings very difficult. And we did have over 250 people attend that first information session. Then, because we welcomed those question submissions from February the 10th to the 20th, and so we know a huge meeting of over 250 attendees online taking questions. We had almost 700 questions, would not be a good use of time. And that's why we decided to gather the questions together, see what the themes were, and give as much information as possible through this presentation and also later on the board website so that people can have their questions answered. We did receive a number of comments as well on the situation and preferred options. And those would also be included when you go to the board website. So we do have a number of themes that we want to share with you today. And as we go through the presentation, you will see those themes emerging. Another question came around no tours or pictures. And what we did last time was we provided photos of what the schools would look like after renovations. So currently both Barton and Sherwood would need renovations to bring them up to provincial benchmarks. All school facilities have provincial benchmarks of what, things like science labs, learning commons, gymnasiums should look like. And so you can go back to the original presentation to see some of those photos. But what we did do is we gave you floor plans for both schools so you could get a sense of the layout and the space. And once again, I mentioned the link, and here is the link where you can go to read more about all the information and see some of those photos that we posted in that PowerPoint. Another part of the process is delegations. So what delegations are is when an individual or group addresses the Board of Trustees at a board meeting. And there's a process for delegations. We know there's quite an interest in individuals or groups being able to delegate to the Board of Trustees on this topic. So as a result, the Board of Trustees will hold a special board meeting on Tuesday, March 22nd at 5:30 p.m. And this is really in order to hear those delegations and provide equitable access, because there are time limits to the length of board meetings. And so normally the board meetings that are scheduled already have a lot of business items on there already. So we felt it was important to provide that opportunity to have delegations. Delegations will have up to 5 minutes per request. And if you're interested in doing a delegation, or a group is interested, they have to reapply for this specific date. I believe some have already applied for earlier dates, but you'll reapply just to make sure that your request is not lost. And requests need to be submitted by email to Heather Miller, the trustee officer, by noon of Friday, March 18th. That's the Friday of the March break. but you can send them in at any time. That's just the deadline, and has to address a topic on the agenda. And you can learn more about what exactly is involved in terms of delegations of percentage trustees by accessing the board website, and the link is there for you to do so. Also want to talk a little bit about Barton and related to the Barton site. So one of the questions that has come through is why Barton hasn't been declared surplus so far. And for those of you who may be unaware, when a school site is no longer needed by the Board of Trustees, they can decide to declare it surplus and sell it, and then use the proceeds of disposition, or the money they get, for other sites or renewal options within the board. So Barton was used actually up until October 2020, because it was being used as a temporary holding school for Nora Francis Henderson, the newest secondary school on the mountain. And that new school opened October 2020. So at that point, Barton was empty. And that was when staff gave a report to the Board of Trustees related to the 3 options that we are talking about today, and through the survey for Sherwood. That status quo, moving permanently to the Barton site, or staying at the Sherwood site with both Barton and Sherwood having renovations. At that time, the Board of Trustees decided to try one more time to get funding for a new school, a replacement school on the Sherwood site from the provincial government. And it was also decided that if the board couldn't get that funding from the province, then we would engage the public, and then a final decision would be made. So that's where we are right now. So the Barton site would still be required for either option 2 or 3. It'll either be used, as a holding site for Sherwood students, or as a permanent site, depending on the final decision that the Board of Trustees makes. Also wanted to just give you a little bit of history. We talked about this at the last presentation last week, around just what some of the challenges have been at Sherwood in terms of the site. So way back in 2012, 10 years ago, there was a secondary accommodation review, and Sherwood was one of the schools that remained open. Some other schools were closed, but Sherwood remained open. And it was identified that Sherwood needed a large number of renewal needs. And the board, that was when, back in 2012, the board started asking the ministry for funding to build that new school, a replacement school, on the same property. The other thing that was happening at the same time as a result of the pupil accommodation review is that in those remaining 13 secondary schools, a lot of significant renovations and secondary facility benchmark work has already been completed in those. And when a feasibility study, which means they looked at a study to see what would be involved in terms of doing that renewal work at Sherwood, and to estimate the costs and the timing, it was determined that really a lot of time was going to be needed to complete that work, and that staff and students couldn't be in the building at that time, unfortunately. In some cases, in other schools, we've been able to sort of close off sections of the building and work on those sections while students and staff use other sections. But it wasn't possible at Sherwood, because there's so much asbestos there, and the type of asbestos that is needed. So before we can do any renovations, of course, asbestos needs to be removed. And it wasn't possible to close off some safely while that asbestos was being removed. In order to remove the asbestos, we need to close the entire school and not have any staff or students there. So that added another level of complication onto the renovations and the renewal at Sherwood. And that's also why we are, one of the options is if Sherwood remains as the site for secondary school students, they would have to move out for up to 2 years in order to have that asbestos removed, and then they would move back in once the asbestos removed and the renewal and renovations were complete. So now I'm going to turn it over to, on the next slide, to the senior manager of facilities, David Anderson. Take it away, Dave.
Thanks very much, Sue. And so I'll continue along with the themed questions and responses as the Associate Director and Superintendent alluded to earlier. So the next theme that we're looking at is funding. So we had a number of questions come through in terms of what funding is available and how can we access that additional funding. So the first source that we have available to us is the capital priorities submissions. And so those are ministry-led initiatives that are typically announced by the ministry on an annual basis. And it gives the board an opportunity to go ahead and make a business case submission for a new build. So that means bricks and mortar is the only thing that the capital priorities can really fund. And those business cases are usually as a result of growth in the community, like we see in areas such as Binbrook or Waterdown, or they could be a consolidation of schools, etc. So these are the capital priority submissions that we've gone through 8 times with the ministry and not been successful. Again, that is funding for bricks and mortar, so a new school or an addition. The next component we have is the school renewal allocation, and it's just what it suggests. It's money that the ministry provides us for renewal of existing schools. So this funding specifically cannot be used for brick and mortar, so new schools or additions. It's specifically allocated for renewal work at all of our schools. And we receive approximately $8 million on an annual basis from the ministry for renewal. The next funding source we have available to us is known as School Condition Improvement, so SCI as it's known. So this is specific funding that we receive again from the ministry on an annual basis. This is set aside to revitalize or renew building components that you see listed there. So windows, roofs, are the big components, HVAC, electrical, etc. And again, this is for all of our schools in the inventory. Again, cannot be used for new schools or additions. And on an annual basis, historically, we've seen in the range of $18 to $20 million allocated to the school board. Next, we have proceeds of disposition. So as the Associate Director indicated to earlier, when a property is declared surplus and potentially sold, the proceeds from that sale are known as proceeds of disposition. So this is money that is available to the board, but when we receive funds from a sale of a property, those funds go into a pot essentially and aren't directed to one specific project, but rather serve the entire board as a whole. And assist us with our capital plans and renewal work that we have identified through trustees and their work. So the ministry does require that we use the proceeds in alignment with the school condition improvement related funds. So that is to say windows, roofs, HVAC, that sort of thing. We can request an exemption from the minister, but those exemptions are of course looked at very carefully, and as they do not only apply to us, they would set a precedent for the 71 other boards in Ontario. So the minister does provide exemptions, but they are carefully considered. When we look at our financial statements from August 31st, 2021, the board currently at that time had $35 million in proceeds available on the books. So the process around the property sale and the future use for either site was something that we saw continually coming up as a theme. So the future of either site is yet to be determined. So trustees, depending on the decision that's made, may decide to declare the alternate location surplus once the Sherwood students are homed in their permanent location. Once declared surplus, the board may also then decide to sell the property. And then the board is regulated by the ministry through Ontario Regulation 44498, and of course the board's policy on property disposition in terms of how that process is laid out. So it's available on our website, and we can certainly share that link through the information that's being shared tonight as well. But it does set out a very clear process in terms of who we can sell to, when, and for how long we need to have those properties available. So The future at this time is really yet to be determined. We don't know if they'll be determined surplus to the board's needs, and then again potentially available for sale to be determined. So it's difficult to predict. The future land value of either site is not something that's part of the decision or the discussion with trustees at this point in time. We do estimate as staff that the per acre proceed would be approximately the same for both properties, but again, something, not something that we have brought forward at this time in terms of value for discussion or decision for trustees. We had some questions around donations and the availability of donations that could be raised to help pay for capital improvements. So donations aren't something that is supported at publicly funded school boards. And of course, it's not supported through our policy as well, just in terms of equity across the board and that sort of thing. It's not something that is deemed supported by either the ministry or the board. So the work that is required will be funded through renewal dollars, school renewal dollars allocation, or school condition improvement dollars at this time. So we had some questions around the renewal work specific to Sherwood, and the list is there. We as a board have invested just about $2.5 million of renewal and school condition improvement dollars over the past 10 years at Sherwood. So windows and doors were completed, stucco repairs at the auditorium, gymnasium floor was replaced. We had a boiler upgrade, LED lighting retrofit project. So that particular project was funded by a one-time opportunity for greenhouse reduction funds from the ministry. So not part of our SCI or school renewal dollars, but a one-time funding strategy. Barrier-free parking spaces at the main level entrance. The hot water heat exchangers were done, and then probably most recently were the learning commons flooring, again out of a bit of a health and safety concern that was identified. So that's the work that's been identified over the past 10 years roughly at Sherwood, approximately $2.5 million in value. And again, the benchmark work was paused as we worked through the process of submitting the 8 submissions to the ministry for a new school on the Sherwood site. We've identified approximately $6.1 million of school renewal or school condition improvement work that has been completed at the remaining secondary schools in our inventory over the past 10 years, just as a comparator. Of course, this wouldn't include new schools such as Bernie Custis or Nora Francis Henderson, as those were both funded by the capital priorities submissions. But just to give you an idea as to what has been happening across the system. We do see some of our older schools as comparators to a newer school such as Waterdown or Saltfleet. An older school such as Churchill may receive more monies, but as an average, we're looking at approximately 6.1 as compared to the 2.5 at Sherwood. So just some information here around renewal. Again, we had an awful lot of questions come through in terms of just clarifying the 11.6, the 6, the 9 million, and just where those numbers originated from. So it's an awful lot of numbers and information provided here, but again, this information will be provided on the website as will this recording, so feel free to please review the information after it's shared. I know it is a lot of information being shared tonight. You can see each site is broken down, Sherwood and Barton. The total renewal work required, so per FCI data, and FCI is Facility Condition Index. That's a number that the ministry shares with us. They retain a third party known as VFA Canada who assesses each of our buildings, not only our buildings, but the other 71 buildings across Ontario. Those buildings are assessed, and then that value is shared with the school board. So the renewal work required at Sherwood is approximately $28.3 million. We can see at the Barton site, it's approximately $20 million. Out of these renewal dollars, so that's all categories, we have what's known as high and urgent needs in the facility condition index. And those high and urgent needs are identified as 11.6 million at Sherwood and 5.1 at the Barton site. The renewal work that's proposed at each site, so 6 million for Sherwood and 3.5 million for Barton, are identified there. And there's some confusion perhaps around the 11.6 versus the 6, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then of course the benchmark work that's being proposed and earmarked was the 9 million at Sherwood and then the 4.5 at Barton. 4.5 being around the average what we're paying at the secondary level for the improvements that have been approved by trustees in terms of the secondary benchmarks that included items such as the learning commons, the science labs, the gym floors, and that sort of thing, and then moving through to the next set of secondary benchmarks, which include hallways, washrooms, cafeterias, that sort of thing. And I know folks had suggested that the work at the library or learning commons at Sherwood has already been completed. That was a smaller renovation in terms of the flooring that was completed, but we'd be looking at the entire space and bringing it up to the same standards that we have at our other secondary schools. Next slide, please. So I touched on this a little bit. So it's important to note that not all high and urgent renewal work is completed at all schools. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons is funding allocation and availability of funds. So the high and urgent renewal needs for all of the schools currently in the board's inventory is 246 million. And again, just a reminder of what we receive on an annual basis is approximately 28 million per year to address these renewal needs and any others that may come up, as well as emergencies. So the board's in a position where we have to prioritize our renewal work. So we see components that are identified again through that FCI data, Facility Condition Index data, that there are components in there that won't necessarily be addressed. So items such as HVAC or water distribution systems are included in those high and urgent needs as a replacement, but they typically only happen locally as to not impact the entire facility. There's other components such as underground services on the site, so drainage underground that may be identified, but again, not a priority when we're looking at 246 million of high and urgent backlog compared to the 28 million that we receive annually. So as a comparator, I'll use a residential renovation as an example. So you may have an older home that has older pipes or older wiring, and you're doing a kitchen renovation. So you're replacing your kitchen sink and you're replacing your dishwasher. You may do some localized plumbing work there. You may do some localized electrical work there, but you're not likely going to open up all the walls and replace all of the plumbing in your entire home or all of the electrical in your entire home. That's sort of what we're looking at in terms of the availability of funds and the work we do that impacts both FCI as well as the learned environment and the space that we provide for our students and staff. We received a number of questions around the asbestos specific at Sherwood. So we have a number of schools that do contain asbestos or asbestos containing materials within the school itself. The Sherwood example is a little bit different, and where it differs from other locations is that we have a sprayed fireproofing on the underside of the floor structure or the roof above. So that is to say, if I'm on the second floor and I was to remove a ceiling tile and look up, before I see the structure, I'm going to see a sprayed fireproofing material. That specific spray fired proofing material involves a manual removal. And what that means is scraping. Physically, manually scraping that material off of the structure from the underside. So that abatement process is time consuming. It's difficult. It's laborious. We'll probably see, if this is the option that's selected, in the range of 100 people at the site when there is abatement underway. The abatement process is something that is done at other locations, and we can isolate the HVAC equipment or the air handling units. The other piece at Sherwood is that HVAC component and the return air plenum doesn't allow us to isolate whether it's a floor or a space within the school. So unfortunately, specific to Sherwood, and when we looked at this through the feasibility study, with our consultants, I think it was back in 2015 and 16, Sherwood needs to be vacated. So we can't have staff and students in the building, and this is essentially the main reason why the costs are that much higher at Sherwood than other schools. We had some questions around timing. The renovation and renewal work at Barton, the Barton site, could start immediately following the trustee decision. If we are directed to house Sherwood students at Barton, construction again could start essentially immediately with some demolition work, and then the construction is expected to take 14 to 18 months to complete. The renovation work and renewal work, again, due to the asbestos abatement, would begin as soon as staff and students are out of the building in June 2022, and that construction work is expected to take 18 to 24 months to complete. We had some questions around the capacity of each school, and I'm just sharing this in terms of a chart for ease of use. So the on-the-ground capacity, or what the school was approved at, is 1,374 pupil places at the Sherwood site and 1,092 at the Barton site. The current enrollment, as we see it now, is approximately 1,253 students. And as we talked February 10th, the projected enrollment at that time was, over the next 5 years, the highest was 1,389, so 1,389. So this essentially means that there is a potential that portables or a permanent addition would be required at the Barton site. We're suggesting it could be 8 classrooms. It depends on how the school is utilized and what those spaces look like. But again, those portables or permanent addition is something that would be funded by the ministry through another source. So that projected enrollment is reviewed and adjusted on an annual basis, and as we indicated, 1,389 is the highest peak over the next 5 years. Noting that secondary schools can operate at 110% capacity without portables, we do expect that there will be a need for portables or an addition upon peak enrollment at the Barton site, and again funded separately, so no cost over and above what's been shared tonight. And I believe at this point I will return it back to the Associate Director. Thank you.
Thank you, Senior Manager Anderson, for all that information. It was a tremendous amount of information in terms of the facility, and so you can see that we really received a lot of questions around the facility, around all the renovations and renewals needed. So just a reminder, you'll be able to review all that, both the explanation, the recording, and also the slides later on if you'd like to review any of that, just to digest some of that. Next question theme that came up was program space. Quite a few questions around different programs currently at Sherwood. And we wanted to let you know again, this was mentioned last week, that both locations can accommodate all programs currently offered at Sherwood. So the Barton site can accommodate all of the programs that are currently offered at Sherwood. One of the things important to note is that the science labs, learning commons, gyms will all receive renovations to make sure that they align with the board's secondary benchmark strategy. And we would also do additional renovations in the shop areas of either school, so either Sherwood or Barton. And that would include safety issues like dust collection and any upgrades that are required to make sure that those spaces are safe and meet the program benchmarks. Next slide, please. Quite a few comments, some questions, but mostly comments around the comparison of the two school buildings and the two sites. And so just wanted to summarize those for you so you're aware of what some of those comments were. And the public, you, identified a number of spaces that they believe would be pros and cons of one building over another. So we're presenting them to you. These aren't pros as that we believe are pros. These came through the comments. We thought it was important to be transparent and share those with you. So some of the pros that were identified by commenters and people who submitted questions were related to Sherwood was that they have a larger gymnasium space and workout area. The auditorium is larger and the foyer is larger. As related to the Barton site, some of the pros identified once again by commenters or people who submitted questions are that classrooms are on the exterior of the building. So they have windows for both light and air circulation because approximately 2/3 of the Sherwood classrooms are located on the interior of the building. So they don't have windows that go to the outside. Next slide, please. There were also some comparisons around the actual school properties by commenters and people who submitted questions. So just to share those with you. So some of the pros that were commented on related to Sherwood included that they're close to city locations for different extracurriculars and programs. The Sherwood site is close to the stairs, the escarpment stairs. The property is larger, as we shared last week when we showed you the actual size of each property. And the location is more into the survey and away from major intersections. And related to Barton, people commented that what some of the pros were the ability to use the Beasley property since there are unfenced areas. So even though it's a smaller site, we could use the larger site, and that the school is also located near a major bus line. We wanted to let you know that both properties will receive upgraded sports fields as part of the secondary facility benchmark work, depending on which site becomes a permanent home. So I should be clear on that. It's not both properties will receive, but if the trustees decide on the Sherwood site as a permanent home, then it will get an upgraded sports field. And if the trustees decide on the Barton site as a permanent home, it would receive an upgraded sports field. Just want to make sure that's clear. And the next slide, please. Thank you. A number of questions came from residents around the neighborhood and would it change and how a change in location of Sherwood might affect their property value. We're not able to actually answer this question. It's not within our mandate to comment on property value. We don't have the expertise to do so. And especially because either location, either Sherwood or Barton, has at this point right now an unknown future. So we can't really speculate on what changes would occur at either site if it wasn't going to be used for an HWDSB school. Next slide, please. And also another question theme that came out, there were a number of questions that asked about, their other site considerations. So, and especially Hill Park came up a few times. So Hill Park was a secondary school that's over by, just let me get this right, it's over by, I should know, over by Mohawk and Upper Wentworth. And it was closed, and it's actually now being used for something completely different. So it's number one, it's not in the same catchment boundary. It's quite far away, so it wouldn't be considered. It hasn't been considered, and it won't be considered in terms of a Sherwood option. And in addition, the building houses other programs. So continuing ed is there, alternate education, the Welcome Center, and also the HWDSB archives are there. So it's being well used for other uses at this point. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another question theme that came up was around French immersion. People wondered about changing boundaries for French immersion. So this process that we are in right now, this process to ask for some community feedback, is not a pupil accommodation review, and it's not a boundary review. So it's not a process to review any boundaries, including the HWDSB French immersion boundaries or locations. So currently Sherwood has secondary French immersion, and it would continue to be the other second site for French immersion. A few years ago, we went through an extensive process to decide. It was actually back in 2012, to decide where the location of French and boundaries for French immersion would be at HWDSB in terms of secondary schools. And we're still there. And one of the reasons that it was decided to only have 2 sites instead of other sites is that in order to run a really robust French immersion program with lots of choices in terms of course offerings, you need a good amount of students. And we started small at Sherwood, and then it built up as we added grades. And we know that about 400 and above in terms of French immersion students is really necessary to offer that robust program. And that's where we are with Sherwood. And so we're not looking at adding another location at this time for French immersion. Also had a lot of questions around transportation and how transportation would be affected, or what effect it might have for students who are currently there. So just so everyone knows, the walking distance is 3.2 kilometers. So if you live within 3.2 kilometers of the in-catchment school you attend, then you aren't provided with transportation. You're not eligible for transportation. And when we look at both the Barton site and the Sherwood site, the walkability, what we describe as walkability, is similar for both locations. So we took a look at the past 5 years to see students over the past 5 years, how many live within walking distance of the Barton site and the Sherwood site. And it actually showed that more students over the past 5 years lived within walking distance of the Barton site. So however, we also know that depending on where students live within the catchment, walkability can change year over year as new students come in and other students graduate. There's also some questions around French immersion transportation. And French immersion transportation is provided in a variety of ways. It can be through an HSR pass, or it could be through a black and yellow school bus, or it could be through a smaller bus or even a cab, depending on where the student lives and how many students are coming from a certain area in the city. And also, if you go and read our transportation policy, students can't spend more than 60 minutes on a bus. So that can also determine which kind of transportation is offered to French immersion students. Next slide, please. One of the things we wanted to talk about with all of you is just transitions, because no matter which option is chosen, there will be most likely some kind of transitions needed. Actually, I should correct myself, because there are 3 options on the table. The first option is status quo, which would not need a transition. But the other 2 options, using the Sherwood site or using the Barton site, would both need a transition, because it will involve movement of students for both those 2 options. So there were quite a few questions around transition and the effect on students and whether it should be a permanent or temporary move. So one of the things that we always do when there is going to be a transition for students and staff is we set up a transition committee. And we've done that in every case where that has happened. And so we would do that immediately after the trustee decision. And a transition committee is headed up by the superintendent. And membership includes students, administration, principal, vice principals, the superintendent, as I said, the ward trustee, representatives from staff, representatives from school council and home and school if there is one, and representatives from the community. And the whole purpose of the transition committee is to provide input and advice to the superintendent principals to make transition as smooth as possible. So the committee can surface concerns, make suggestions about what the best way to do things are, hear about plans for the transition. And it's a good way to be involved and to provide that feedback, because we know a transition can be difficult for some people, and the more information you have is always better, so you can prepare for that transition. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I will come to the summary in just a second. We've shared really a tremendous amount of information with you, and tried to group those questions in themes, as you've seen. And if you, once again, I'll encourage you to, read back through the slides once they're posted and listen to the recording as well if you're interested, but you can read through the slides without listening to the recording. You can also, so what I'll just summarize here that's on the slide is that the renewal work and all the secondary facility benchmark work that renovations are not feasible at Sherwood site while students and staff are in the building. So that's one big barrier for us, and that's one of the reasons why we need to do, if we're going to do that work, that we will need to move students and staff. There are many factors to consider in deciding where Sherwood Secondary School should be located, whether it should be at the Sherwood site or at the Barton site. And all of these factors should be considered when deciding on the preferred option. It's not just one factor, there's a number of factors. And the trustees will consider all the factors before they make their decision. And you, the public, will be surveyed on what your preferred option is. And the survey results will be one of the factors that I just mentioned in determining what the best decision is, the best accommodation option for current and future students. So if I could have the next slide, please. Just want to remind you also, this is a repeat of the previous slide because this is something that was not shared last time, that there will be an opportunity for delegations if you're interested. Next slide, please. So what are some next steps? We come to the school and community survey. So you can go to the survey right now and have your say if you like. We've included a QR code right on the screen here, so you can take your phone and it'll take you right to that survey right now. It is open. And so from February the 23rd to March the 7th, the survey will be open, and those three options will be on there. So I just want to read through them to make sure that they're very clear. So the first option is to keep Sherwood students where they are and do enough repairs and upgrades to maintain building safety. So it won't be the level of school renewal that we talked about. Number two option is to move students temporarily, about 2 years, to the Barton site at 75 Palmer Road while Sherwood is renovated. And then once those renovations are done, move students and staff back. And option number three is to move Sherwood to the Barton site permanently after the Barton building is renovated, those school renewals and renovations that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So the survey is through this QR code, or you can go to the board website on Sherwood Survey. You can also email, if the survey is not working for you, directly to research@hwdsb.on.ca, or if you prefer a paper mail, then you can mail a written submission to Research and Analytics, and the address is right there. So we really want to thank you for your attention during this, long presentation full of a lot of information. And we encourage you once again to read back over and to have your say by completing the survey. Next steps will be the information will be posted on the board website, and all the information will be going to the Board of Trustees at a Finance and Facilities Committee, and then there will be time for delegations on March the 22nd, and then a final decision will be made on March 28th at the board meeting, which, and so then you'll know after that date. So thanks once again. I also wanted to thank all the staff and Dave and Colin as well for participating in the presentation. We really appreciate your time, and a huge thanks to facility staff and to communication staff who helped prepare for this presentation to gather all of the questions and then make sure the information is shared with you. Thanks again, and good night.